Hello and welcome to DJFonts tutorials. Today we're going to be looking at how to work with DJFonts in the juicer and specifically what the different effects that are available for each layer do, what possibilities they give you, and how to work with them. Now I'm working with a pre-release version of the juicer, so if your juicer doesn't look exactly the same, don't worry. These basic techniques are pretty much going to be the same no matter how the juicer looks. Now what you're seeing here is the layers that make up the basic brushed metal font, and I'm going to be showing you some ways to make a different look using this font so you can save off your own fonts. And for each layer here, if you click on the little arrow to the left of the layer, it will drop down and it'll show you the mode that layer is in with respect to the other layers below it, the opacity, and this little button that says effects. And that's the one we're going to be concerned with today. That's where we're going to add effects to each individual layer. Now when I click on that, I get a drop down menu with a number of different possibilities, and you'll find out the power of these once you start playing with it, but I'll give you some quick tips. Now in this font here, I'm going to take one of the layers that I know is a full stencil of the actual shape of the layer, which is this fill texture, which is the brushed metal gray here, and I'm just going to right click on top of it and I'm going to duplicate it, and then I'm going to turn off the original layer. And here with this new base layer, I'm going to do some different effects in this space on the letter. So I'm just going to walk down through the effects and show you what each one of these does. If I go to blur, it's going to add these blur settings to that layer, and if I move the slider on blurriness to the right, you'll see that layer gets blurred. Now all these other sharp outer layers are the other layers up here, but on that main letter shaped layer you've got a blurry version of what was there before, which is that gradation of the metal texture. And you have the option to do horizontal and vertical, just horizontal, just vertical, and also whether to repeat the edge pixels. That's this option here, which just means that you won't get empty space on the edge where the blur stops. And then also whether to blend that with the original. In other words, to bring back in some of that metal texture, reduce the amount of blur so that you still have some aspect of what was there before. I'm going to remove that layer, that effect, by coming to this little icon on the right of the blur and right clicking on top of it and saying delete effect. And it returns to what we had before. Next we have brightness and contrast, and that's pretty much self-explanatory. If you increase the brightness, of course you're going to get brighter. If you increase the contrast, that layer is going to get more dark and more light with more contrast. Again, I'm going to delete that. Next we have hue and saturation, and this is one of the ways you can colorize a layer. It's not quite as easy as some of the colorize filters, but it gives you a lot more control in some ways. And you can select which channel you're affecting: reds, yellows, greens, cyans, blues, magentas, or the master, which is all channels. And this little wheel shifts the color. You see now we're going more towards reds, yellows, and greens. And obviously if you, here let's just open this a little bit so you see the saturation and the lightness. If we increase the saturation here, of course we're going to get more color. So you can see that was green, this is red, blue, a blue-green, and so on. And again, you can adjust the lightness, make that a darker color or a lighter color. It works much like the hue saturation in Photoshop, and sometimes this will be your best option, and sometimes a simple or a duo colorize will work better. You just have to sort of experiment with it. And the second option here in hue saturation is you can do a colorize, which will limit, if this was a multicolored layer, it will limit it to one color. We're not really seeing it here because this was already only one tint, one color. But again, the same settings apply. You can change the color here and increase the saturation, make it darker or lighter. I find it's usually best to use hue saturation when you have a complex mix of colors that you want to shift one way or the other, or which you want to convert to one color using the colorize. Otherwise, some of the other options in the effects menu are better. So again, I'm going to get rid of that so that we can look at the next effect, and that is a simple colorize. And that will allow you to just choose one color from a color picker and apply it to that layer, and it'll take the grayscale values of that layer and apply the color accordingly. So in the lighter gray white areas it'll go a lighter blue, a percentage of this color, and in the darker areas it'll go with a darker percentage of that color. And again, you can also blend with the original gray. So what we're seeing here is a much more muted blue. And I'm going to delete that again. And the next option is a duo colorize. And this is a little more complicated to figure out what you're going to end up with, because you get to choose two colors, shadows and highlights. So anything dark in the layer that you're affecting will be affected by this color that you pick for shadows, and anything light in your layer will be affected by the color that you pick for the highlights. So for example, I can get a cool two-color mix from red to yellow here. And again, I can blend with the original to mute it down, but I don't want to do that. So this works well for something that's got a very high contrast look, where you can apply those two colors and really see what you're going to get. If this was a blue, then I'm going to get blue to yellow and a mix thereof in the middle. And again, this is only going to work on a layer where you have highlights and shadows. If it's a layer that's already just one color, it's either going to be one or the other of these two colors. So moving along, I'm going to delete that effect. And the next one we come to is tricolorize. Same basic principle. You've got shadows and highlights, but this time you also have midtones. So you can choose three colors to mix and affect the colors in your image. These colorize options actually work very well with some of the patterns and textures in the fonts. They work well on something that has a lot of colors in it already. But I'll show you here. If I change my shadows to blue, a dark blue, and then my midtones, maybe a bluish green, and my highlights, a bright yellow. And you're going to see, the dark blue is only showing up in these streaks, which are the darkest area of this layer. these streaks. Now, one thing you can do is you can mix effects. So in this case, just to show you, I'm going to add another effect to this layer, which is brightness and contrast. And doing this, I can increase the contrast and decrease the brightness, and you'll see all of a sudden I've got a lot more of my dark area, which the navy blue is getting applied to. That doesn't look very good, so I'm going to get rid of that. So as you can see, when we had a broad range of color in our layer already from dark to light, applying these colors becomes a little easier because you can see where they're going to get applied. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. Now the next effect is the drop shadow effect. And so that we can better see that, I'm going to change the color of my canvas to a dark blue instead of the black. And I'm going to come over here now, because this shape that we're using, this layer that we're using, has this beveled shape on top of it, we're going to need to make our shadow quite large in order for it to show. And I'm going to make it nice and soft and reduce the opacity. Let's lighten up our background even more so you can see. Let's go ahead and make it white. Okay. So you can see our drop shadow here. It works pretty much the same way as a drop shadow in Photoshop or After Effects or any of those other programs you're more familiar with work. So there you go. Now there's another way you can use a drop shadow, and that's, for example, if we go to this depth layer, which is the outer bevel shape around the outline of the letter, and if I add a drop shadow to this layer, again I'm going to have to make it a little bit far out so you can see. What you see happening here is we're making the bevel look like it's raised up off of the fill, so that it gives it a little bit more depth, and you can see the shadow here. If we soften it up a little bit, make it a little more realistic, it gives you a whole different look for that bevel so that it looks like an embossed shape. So that's two different ways you can use the drop shadow. I'm going to go ahead and delete that again and come back down to my main layer and again delete that effect. And the next effect on our list is the invert effect. This is one that you may not use that often, but it can give you some pretty interesting effects in the right circumstances. The main effect is the invert of the RGB channel, and what that basically does is shift everything that was dark to light and everything that was light to dark. So whereas before we had a light to dark metallic texture gradient here, we now have a dark to light. And you can also isolate each channel and invert how that interacts with the other channels, which can give you some interesting color effects. It's a little bit hard to predict unless you get into the science of it, but inverting the red channel will make things look a little more red. Inverting the green channel will give you green to purple, which is its complementary color on the color wheel. Inverting blue will give you blue to yellow, which again is its complementary color on the color wheel. So you're going for opposites here. And the last selection here is inverting the alpha. Now this probably isn't going to be useful that often, especially if you're creating words and text blocks, but if you were just using one letter, you could probably do some really interesting effects by adding textures to this outer area and having that center area transparent, see-through to what's underneath it. So if we go back to the RGB you can see that whereas these streaks used to be dark, now most of them are light. So that's the main use of the invert tool. And you'll find it's usually useful in combination with other effects on top or below it. And moving on, I'm going to delete that effect and move on to the next one, which is fill. Now fill is something that you will use quite often. It basically takes your layer and substitutes whatever was there with this solid color that you choose. And that can give you some very dramatic solid effects, and you'll use it as a base to put other effects on top of. For example, if I turn back on this fill texture that I made a copy of and put it in overlay mode, in multiply mode, then you'll see I've got the base red with the metallic texture on top of it, and that gives you a whole different look. So having a solid color for your base can often be very useful for very strong looks. And I'm going to turn that off again and delete that effect. And as you'll see as I'm going through these effects, because they are applied to the layer and you can turn them off and on, you can delete them and add them, it doesn't affect the layer itself, the pixels of the layer, until you actually render out to your PSD file or JPEG file or whatever format you're going to use. So it means you can always go back and change things once you've saved your settings as a new font. And the final effect we're going to look at in this segment is the offset effect. And this is something that I have used quite a bit in creating some of the standard fonts that you have received with your DJ font libraries. And what it does is it shifts whatever layer you're applying it to the left, right, up, down. And it can give you some interesting 3D depth to what is normally just a flat font. And I'll show you how that can be used by bringing up one of those presets. And you can see this red layer here and this blue layer. Those are solidly filled layers with the same shape as this letter, and they've just been shifted up and down, and that gives a very strong punch of color as well as providing a background for the other effects, and it can be used to quite good effect in some instances. For example, in these, you've got your main letter with the gold bevel, but just to add an extra punch to that letter, I've added this red base, and that shows up just in the edge areas. Now going back to the effect itself, shifting to the right into the positive will move your layer to the right, and shifting the value to the right in the second requester will shift your shape down. And again, you can blend with the original, which is kind of interesting. It's moving the layer back up and filling in those areas. It's the kind of thing that you can experiment with, see what kind of crazy effects you get. But otherwise, this is pretty straightforward. You're talking about just moving that layer up or down or left or right. And I'm going to delete that again. If you look over, I've brought up this other font from the Wave Deco font family. And here the offset has been used to good effect to actually take some of these texture filled layers and shift them way to the left or right so that you go outside the letter completely and add a kind of environmental pattern around the letters. So that's another way that you can use the offset. So that's I'll look at the main effect from this list, this drop-down list here. Obviously there's lots of other ways to affect the layers using blending modes and textures and pattern fills, texture fills, gradient fills. I'll go into each of these, actually just the texture fill and the gradient fill, in a different tutorial because those are a little bit more complex. And pattern fill is something that we will be adding to the juicer in the future. You can create your own patterns, upload your own patterns, but that will be an add-on to the program. So it's not operational as of yet. So until next time, keep experimenting, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.